There are sounds in the night that can be explained. The groan of old wood, the rustle of branches against a window, the hum of pipes in the walls. We tell ourselves these are harmless, ordinary noises. But every so often, there is a sound that doesn't belong. A sound that chills the blood, not because of how loud it is, but because of how impossible it seems. Picture this: a room, still and untouched, the kind of silence where even your breathing feels too loud. And then, it breaks. A fragile sob, the trembling cry of a child. At first, you think it's distant, maybe drifting in from outside. But no, it's close. Too close. And as you strain to hear, the sound sharpens, pressing in from the corner of the room. From a shape that was supposed to be nothing more than cloth and porcelain. A doll. Its glass eyes fixed in your direction, its mouth closed. Yet the crying doesn't stop. In fact, it grows heavier, as though it knows you're listening. Now ask yourself, what would you do if you were the only one who could hear it? What if every person you turned to insisted the room was silent? Would you doubt your ears or your sanity? Because for one family, this question was no longer a thought experiment. It became their reality. And one night, the night the doll cried, what they experienced was so disturbing, it was never spoken of openly again, until now. This is not just another ghost story. This is the account of a single night, a night that would alter the course of one family's life forever. To understand why, we have to look deeper into one of humanity's oldest fears, the fear of objects that should be lifeless, but aren't. Across cultures and centuries, dolls have always carried a peculiar weight. They are not like other toys. They resemble us, but they are not us. They smile, but never move their lips. They watch, but never blink. And in countless traditions, from Japanese ningyo to European porcelain figures, dolls are said to act as vessels, containers for energy, memory, even the restless souls of the departed. Most of the time, these stories are dismissed as folklore, harmless tales meant to frighten children into obedience. But every so often, one story surfaces that feels different, one story that refuses to be ignored. The tale you are about to hear is one of those stories. It began in an ordinary house, on an ordinary street, with a family who wanted nothing more than a fresh start. They had no interest in curses, no belief in haunted relics. They moved into that house with laughter, with plans, with dreams of a new life. But in the attic, among boxes of dust and forgotten belongings, they found something that would change everything. A doll. Old, porcelain, dressed in faded lace. Its paint was chipped, its face cracked by time, its glass eyes wide and unblinking. The kind of object most people would pass by without a second thought. But for this family, that doll was no forgotten relic. It was a reminder, a warning, and on one night, it would cry with a voice no one could explain. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the doll cried. You'll hear what the family heard, and you'll know why some believe it should have been destroyed decades ago, before it ever had the chance to be found again. The family at the center of this story was the Harts. Michael and Elaine, parents in their 30s, had been looking for a new beginning. With two young children, a boy of 8 and a girl just 6, they wanted a quiet place outside the noise of the city. When they found the old house on Ashgrove Lane, it seemed, at first, like exactly what they needed: spacious, affordable, tucked away behind a line of tall, crooked oaks. It was the kind of house that looked tired but dignified, its wooden beams weathered by decades, its windows clouded with the dust of time. They moved in on a gray afternoon in late autumn. The air carried the faint bite of cold, and the sky seemed heavy, as though the sun itself struggled to reach through the gathering clouds. The moment they stepped inside, they noticed it: the hush. A silence so complete that even their footsteps seemed too loud against the floorboards. The house smelled faintly of varnish and old paper. Wallpaper peeled at the corners, revealing layers of patterns left behind by those who had lived there before. Every door gave a reluctant protest when opened, each hinge releasing a tired groan as though disturbed from a long slumber. It was in the attic that they found it. The attic was reached by a narrow set of stairs, tucked away behind a door near the back of the house. Dust swirled in the beam of Michael's flashlight as he pulled the cord and revealed the space above. Stacks of boxes lined the edges, some collapsing under their own weight. A trunk sat pushed against the far wall, its lid bowed with age. And when Elaine pried it open, she found what she thought, at first, was only a bundle of old fabric. But as she lifted it into the light, the truth became clear. It was a doll. Porcelain, its surface marked with thin fractures like veins. Its dress was once white, but now stained with yellow age, trimmed with lace that crumbled at the touch. The hair was brittle, a faded golden color, arranged in stiff curls. And the eyes, glass eyes, fixed wide open, caught the faintest reflection of the flashlight beam, making it appear, for a moment, alive. The children were immediately unsettled. The little girl, Anna, asked if they could put it back, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. But Elaine, brushing off the unease, insisted it was harmless, just an old keepsake from a forgotten time. Michael placed the doll on a shelf in the corner of the attic, intending to sort through it later with the rest of the items left behind. None of them thought much more about it, at least not in that moment. But even then, there was something unusual, a feeling that the attic had grown colder, that the air was heavier somehow. They dismissed it, of course, as nothing more than imagination, the tricks of a tired mind in a new house. But as the day faded into night, unease lingered. Elaine caught herself glancing at the attic door more than once, as if expecting to hear something beyond it. The children whispered about the doll at dinner, their voices hushed, glancing nervously at the ceiling above their heads. Michael tried to laugh it off, insisting it was just an object, just porcelain and paint. And yet, even he avoided looking at the attic stairs as the lamps dimmed and the house settled around them. Would you have kept a doll you found hidden in your attic? Or would you have thrown it away immediately? Because the Harts chose to keep it. And on the very first night, they realized something was terribly wrong. The first night in the house was quiet. Almost too quiet. The Harts settled into their rooms, exhausted from the move. The children fell asleep quickly, but Elaine lay awake, listening to the peculiar silence. Old houses often creak, settle, whisper in their own way, but this one felt different. Every sound seemed deliberate, as though the house itself was listening back. Around midnight, Elaine thought she heard something faint, a soft sound, almost muffled by the thick stillness. At first, she dismissed it as the wind outside, but the longer she listened, the clearer it became. It was not the wind, it was sobbing, a child sobbing, slow, drawn-out cries that seemed to rise and fall in rhythm with breath. She froze, her heart quickening. The children were asleep down the hall, and yet, the sound did not come from their rooms. It came from above, from the attic. Elaine rose from bed and crept down the hall, opening the door to Anna's room. The little girl was sound asleep, her breathing steady, clutching a stuffed rabbit. Elaine stood there for a long moment listening. The crying had stopped. She closed the door gently, convincing herself it was only in her mind. But in the morning, she noticed something strange. The doll, which Michael had left on a shelf in the attic, was no longer there. Instead, it was sitting neatly at the end of the upstairs hallway. No one admitted to moving it, and the children swore they hadn't gone near it. That was the beginning. Over the next several nights, the incidents continued. Each time they placed the doll back in the attic, it returned somewhere else. Once, in the corner of the living room. Another time, perched on the windowsill of the master bedroom. Each time, its glass eyes seemed to follow them, reflecting the faint glow of the lamps. And worse still, the crying returned. Not every night, but often enough to keep them awake, listening in the dark. Michael tried to explain it away. Old pipes, air moving through the walls, the tricks of a house they didn't yet understand. But Elaine was not so easily convinced, and soon the children began to suffer. Both Anna and her brother James complained of nightmares, dreams where a child stood at the foot of their bed, face obscured, voice trembling, whispering, "Help me."
Help me!
In the morning, they would wake with tears on their cheeks, unable to say why. Then, one morning, Elaine found something that rattled her deeply. The doll was sitting on the kitchen table, positioned upright, its head tilted slightly down as if watching. But the detail that froze her were its eyes. Tiny streaks of moisture traced down from them, glistening in the morning light, as though the doll had been weeping during the night. When she called Michael over, the streaks were gone. Nothing remained but the cold, lifeless glass staring back at them. He insisted it was condensation, a trick of the light, but Elaine knew what she had seen, and she could not forget it. If you heard crying coming from a doll in your home, would you investigate, or would you leave the house for good? Because the heart stayed. They stayed long enough to learn that the crying wasn't the scariest part. The doll began to speak. By the third week, the hearts could no longer dismiss what was happening inside the house. The crying had grown bolder, sometimes faint and far away, other times echoing through the very walls. But worse than the crying were the whispers. It began with Elaine. She was folding laundry late one evening, the house quiet, except for the faint ticking of the hallway clock. That was when she heard it. A voice, small, broken, almost too faint to catch. She turned, thinking one of the children had gotten up, but no one was there. The voice came again, 2 words, "Don't leave." She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The sound was not drifting through the walls. It was right behind her, low, deliberate, coming from the doll sitting on the chair by the door. From that moment forward, the atmosphere of the house began to change. The warmth drained from certain rooms, replaced by sudden pockets of cold that made their skin prickle. Shadows seemed longer, darker, refusing to retreat even when the lamps were lit. The children began avoiding the upstairs hallway altogether, darting past it as though something unseen lingered there. At night, the family kept their doors locked, but the sense of being watched never left them. Michael, desperate for an explanation, began researching the house. What he uncovered was grim. Decades earlier, a family had lived there with a little girl no older than Anna. Records showed she had fallen gravely ill and died inside those walls. Some accounts suggested she spent her final weeks clutching her favorite possession, a porcelain doll. The description matched the one in their attic exactly. Michael found an old newspaper clipping in the local archives, yellowed, brittle, nearly forgotten. The headline read, "Tragedy on Ash Grove Lane. Child's death shrouded in mystery." The photograph beside it showed the house, and through an upstairs window, the faint outline of something small sitting still, a doll. The more they learned, the worse the house seemed to become. The crying grew louder, the whispers more distinct. Elaine reported hearing a phrase repeated over and over. "It hurts." Sometimes the voice drifted through the air like a sigh. Sometimes it came sharp and sudden, as though shouted directly into her ear. The children's dreams became night terrors. They spoke of a pale figure standing in the shadows of their room, head bowed, hands clutching something close. When asked what the figure held, both children gave the same answer: the doll. The family grew weary, sleep-deprived, and afraid to speak too openly about what they were experiencing. But one night, it escalated further. Michael awoke suddenly, his chest heavy, his breathing labored. At first, he thought it was a nightmare, until he opened his eyes. The doll was there, sitting on his chest, its cracked porcelain face inches from his own, its glass eyes reflecting the moonlight through the window. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The weight was unbearable, far heavier than a simple doll should ever be. And then he heard it. A whisper, soft, close enough to feel against his ear. "Don't leave me." Michael screamed, and in an instant, the doll was gone, now resting upright on the floor beside the bed, staring up at him from the shadows. Would you burn the doll, or keep it locked away? Comment what you'd do. Because for the Hearts, the choice was never that simple. It was the last night the Hearts would ever spend in the house. By then, sleep had become rare. They had grown accustomed to the crying, the whispers, even the shifting of shadows where no person stood. But nothing prepared them for what was about to happen, what they would later call the night the doll cried. It began just after midnight. At first, the sound was faint, like it always had been, small sobs drifting down from the attic. But this time, it didn't stop. The crying grew louder, stronger. Within minutes, it was no longer isolated to one room. It echoed through every hallway, every corner of the house, as though the walls themselves were weeping. The children woke first, terrified, clutching their blankets as the sound surrounded them. Elaine tried to comfort them, but the sobs deepened into something far more chilling. Screams. Piercing, ragged screams, the kind only born from pain. The air vibrated with it, shaking the glass in the windows, rattling the dishes in the cupboards. The house trembled as if alive, its structure groaning beneath the weight of the noise. Lights flickered wildly. Lamps blinked on and off, plunging them into stuttering darkness. Every door they tried slammed shut with violent force, locking itself before their hands could grip the knob. The hearts ran from room to room, searching for an escape, but every path was sealed. The house had become a trap, holding them within the storm of cries. Thunder cracked outside, though the night had been clear. Shadows stretched across the walls, twisting, moving with intent. And at the center of it all was the doll. It sat in the middle of the upstairs hallway, its cracked face turned toward them, its glass eyes glinting in the strobe of the flickering lights. The sobs came not from the walls but from it, from that small, lifeless mouth that now seemed to heave with grief. And then, before their eyes, the sobs broke into something sharper, a scream, high-pitched, inhuman. The sound was so violent it rattled their bones, pressed against their eardrums, until they thought their heads would burst. Michael grabbed the children and tried to push open the front door, but it wouldn't budge. He slammed his shoulder against it again and again, to no effect. Elaine screamed that they had to get out, her voice barely audible over the chaos. The air grew icy, their breath visible as they gasped for air. And then, suddenly, it all stopped. The screaming, the thunder, the flickering lights. The silence was instant. Absolute. The kind of silence that weighs heavy on the chest, where even the smallest movement feels deafening. And then, cutting through that silence, came a sound that was worse than the crying, worse than the screams. It was the sound of a child laughing. The hearts turned toward the hallway. The doll was still there, but it was not the same. Its porcelain face, once cold and smooth, was fractured in new places. Long, jagged cracks spread down its cheeks, streaked as though from tears. The faint glimmer of moisture seemed to cling to the lines, reflecting the dim light. It had cried. The doll had cried. The family backed away slowly, clutching one another, too horrified to speak. And as they watched, the air shifted. A pressure built in the room, heavy, suffocating. The doll's head tilted slightly to one side, the sound of grinding porcelain faint but distinct. And then, they saw something that to this day remains unexplained. When morning finally came, the Hart family gathered the courage to return to the hallway. They expected to find the doll still sitting there, cracked and broken, waiting for them. But it was gone. Every corner of the house was searched. The attic, the basement, the closets. Yet the doll had simply vanished. No trace of porcelain, no remnants of fabric, nothing. It was as if it had never existed at all. And yet, the house was not silent. When the family played back the home recordings they had made that night, hoping to convince others of what they had endured, the sound was there, layered into the static, faint at first, then rising unmistakably. The sound of crying, a child's sobs, echoing through the tape, long after the doll itself had disappeared. They moved out the following week, leaving the house locked, untouched. But the story of that night spread. And when local records were pulled, the truth came to light. Theirs was not the first encounter. Decades earlier, other tenants of the same house had reported nearly identical experiences. Whispers in the dark, footsteps in empty rooms, the sound of a young child weeping when no children were present. Each story traced back to one name, Margaret Whitfield, a little girl who had lived and died in that home in the early 1900s. She was buried without ceremony, but her doll, her only companion in life, was never found. And so the folklore grew. Some say the doll wanders still, searching for the warmth of a family, the comfort of a home. Others say it attaches itself to those who dare to acknowledge its cries. There are even whispers of travelers and collectors who claim to have heard the same sobbing in their own homes, long after the Hart family's ordeal had ended. Which raises the question, if a doll can cry, if it can scream, if it can laugh, can it also choose? Choose who to follow, who to haunt, who to claim. The Harts never saw the doll again, but the recordings remain, and the sound has never faded. Some say the doll is still out there, waiting, listening, searching for its next home. Maybe even yours. The Hart family left that house. The doll vanished. The recordings remain. But the question still lingers, unanswered. What if the things we dismiss as lifeless are only waiting? Waiting for the right night, waiting for the right person, waiting to wake. And now, I'll leave you with this. If you've ever experienced something strange, maybe with a toy, a doll, or an object from your childhood, share your story in the comments below. I'll be reading them in the dark tonight. And if this story kept you awake, subscribe, if you dare, because the next nightmare is darker still, and some say it's based on events far closer to home than you'd ever expect.